Hello everyone, my name is Naomi Stead. I'm a professor and head of the Department of Architecture at Monash University. And this event, Light at the End of the Tunnel number 12, oh, according to me it's number 13, Justine.
Oh, it is, that's my typo, isn't it?
Is a collaboration between Monash Architecture and Parla. As always, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the people of the Greater Kulin Nations as the traditional owners upon which Monash operates, although of course we have participants here from all over Australia and all manner of traditional owner groups. So on behalf of Parla, we acknowledge the traditional custodians across Australia's many nations and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to the Indigenous Australians who are part of the Parla community. This series, Light at the End of the Tunnel, has been running for some months now, and it looks into architecture, how architecture will be affected by the pandemic. And we understand architecture broadly as a profession, a discipline, and as a practice. This week, our guests are John Held and Lewis Moore, representing the ACA and the Architecture Lobby, respectively. Justine will introduce Lewis and John in a moment, but first I'll run through the protocols for the session as always. So please make sure your microphone is off, is on mute. But if you wish to, and if you have the capacity, we welcome you leaving your camera on. We do love to see your faces. The format of the session is a Q&A. It's meant to be informal but informative. Justine and I will ask questions throughout and keep things flowing, but we'll also take questions from the floor throughout. So we ask you to please put your questions into the chat. And then if we have selected your question, we will invite you to put it live. We'll throw to you, ask you to unmute yourself and frame your question verbally. At the same time, please feel free to add your own observations and experiences into the chat. We're very happy for you to share a parallel narrative and insights on what is being said. They don't have to be questions, is the point. We won't get to all of the questions, we never do, but they do help to inform subsequent sessions. Now, this particular occasion, we have an extra protocol, which is that if you would like to tell stories about your own experience, perhaps positive, perhaps negative, we recommend that if you're going to speak about a negative experience, it is probably advisable that you do not directly name the practice. You can tell why we would be saying this, because we're trying to protect you from defamation action, and we're also obviously trying to protect ourselves. So we're happy to hear from you privately or separately about, with more specifics about your situation, and we may be able to assist or direct you to people who can assist. But please, if you're talking about an experience and you're doing it either in the chat or verbally, we recommend that you not name the practice. Be cautious about that. Now I'm going to throw to Justine to introduce John and Lewis. And Justine, I'm going to remind you to stop sharing the screen.
There we go. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Very lovely to see so many familiar faces out there. And we're also very happy that we've got people joining us who haven't been to one of our Friday lunchtime sessions before. So we hope that you find it interesting and engaging, and we hope that you join us for future events as well. So today we're talking about employment, about the rules and regulations, about rights, obligations and responsibilities. And all of this is captured in the Architects Award and in the National Employment Standards. But we're also really interested in the broader question of care. Employment's not just about meeting legal obligations, there's also an ethical component. So here at Parla, we want to ensure that everyone knows their rights and meets their responsibilities. But as I said, we're also interested in how practices and the people who work in them can care for each other in this employment context as we navigate the pandemic. I've always been rather concerned that many people in architecture are unaware of the Architects Award. Some don't know that there's a minimum wage, and many are not familiar with the National Employment Standards. Of course, we all get that when we sign on to a job, we get given those standards, but whether we ever read them is another matter. I'm pretty sure I didn't. But this is problematic because these are the documents that outline the rights and responsibilities that I was talking about of both employees and employers. And it's also important that everyone knows that there's a union that represents architects, Professionals Australia, and an association that represents architectural employers, the Association of Consulting Architects. And these two entities negotiate the Architects Award. This, I think, just, you know, we just kind of need to know this base stuff before we begin. I think the other thing I'd like to talk about as an introduction is we've had some, as you all know, we've conducted our work and wellbeing survey recently, and that had some very good news in it. It's 85% of respondents were between moderately and very confident that their employer understood their legal responsibilities, and 89% of respondents felt broadly supported by their employer during the pandemic. Those numbers are higher than I would have thought. I think that's part, you know, I guess I probably, here at Parlour, we do hear a lot of the horror stories, and we do hear, you know, quite a lot of things where people are not operating within those sort of legal frameworks. So I found that very heartening. That there was a broad sense that people were actually, the majority of practices that our respondents were working for were operating as they should, and more than that, supporting their employers. So to talk about all of this today, we have joined by John Held and Lewis Moore. Naomi and I were joking before, this is our first all-male panel, but luckily Naomi and I are here. So that, John is the National President of the Association of Consulting Architects and a Director of Russell & Yelland in Adelaide. John is the President of the Employer Association, but he brings a really strong commitment to the profession as a community. And in his recent President's comments published on the ACA website, he's focused a lot on the importance of patience, kindness, communication and care. Lewis is a graduate of Monash and a member and activist of the Union, Professional Architects Australia, the Architecture Lobby and Victorian Socialists. And I feel, sort of in the interest of transparency, I should probably declare my own connections. So I've worked with John for a number of years as an editor for the ACA. And I've also recently joined the board of the Architecture Lobby at an international level. And I've had my first meeting with that. So Parlour has good relationships with both organisations, as do I personally. So welcome, John and Lewis. Thank you for joining us. I want to start with this question of rights and responsibilities. And as I've said, my impression, which may be incorrect, is that not as many people are as familiar with the Architects Award as we would like. And so I guess I'm interested to know from your perspectives, without kind of listing, you know, going through the whole award, what do you think are the most important things that people should know about that award as employees and as leaders within the practice? John, do you want to start? What should everyone know about this thing?
Well, the critical thing about the Architects Award is A, that it exists, that it works from students all the way through till about 3 years after registration, and then it sort of really cuts out. So it's only setting the basis of employment in those first 6 to 8 years, I guess, of your profession, of your career. But it does set down all of the minimum requirements for employment of architects and graduates and students. And I think the last one is pretty critical, because there are many professions where students are not covered by any award, where there is nothing to stop you, for example, having unpaid internships that go forever. And some of the practices we see in the UK and the US in particular are specifically not allowed under this award. So from the point of view of students and recent graduates, I think it's pretty important to understand that this is a legal minimum obligation. And our as practice directors, you have to comply with the award. It's illegal and it's a breach of the requirement if you don't. So that, you know, that's the sort of the basis we work off of, and everything else on top of that should be the start of actually providing really good employment conditions for the practices and all the people who work there.
Lewis, what do you want people to know about the award?
Yeah, I mean, look, the fact that it has your minimum wage in there makes it important, especially as you're entering the industry, obviously. But I think it's also worth being aware of like the limitations of the protections provided by the award. Like under the award, it specifies that you're meant to be paid for working overtime, which, we know, I don't think there's anyone on this call who would be surprised to learn that that is not a standard practice throughout architecture, and that endlessly people are working overtime that is unpaid. And so this is why I think it's necessary not just to be aware of the award, but to also be, active in organized within your industry. Like why I think things like Archilobby and the union are necessary, because without actually having some means of recourse, some organization that can enforce it, there is, obviously a tendency for employers to get away with what they can. And yeah, I think overtime is a kind of key example of that in architecture.
I just probably add the other one, which is particularly important to is time off in lieu. So those two, the overtime and the time off in lieu. And I think you'll find pretty strong that the ACA tries to ensure that that this is really important for employers, that they don't just expect people to work till 10 o'clock at night without pay. And perhaps we can talk about time management and some of the other issues related to sort of poor practices as we go through.
Okay. I've got a list of questions here, and I might just run to one that's right at the bottom of my list that I thought we might get to later, but in relation to that, and I don't think we want to spend the whole session dwelling on the terrible things that can happen, but I am very interested to know, I think, John, the ACA advocates very strongly that people follow the award, that time off in lieu, unpaid overtime, all the rest of it. But as Lewis said, we know that it's happens a lot in sections of the profession. So and I think this is a problem that I suppose many organisations struggle with. So Parla, I know the architecture lobby at an international level has had this conversation, and I think probably also locally. We're not in a position to call out bad behaviour. We mostly try to show good behaviour and promote those who do well and provide guidance and provide support. And I think the ACA does likewise. But what recourse do we have for those who do flout the award? Like, how do we call people to account?
Lewis, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. It's obviously a huge problem. There are whisper networks. If you know someone who's worked at a practice, that is often the best way to find out if that practice is going to be treating people well. And to the extent that architecture workers are able to choose the practices that they work for, have some influence in that way. But yeah, it's a huge problem. The fact that at the start of this call, you were warning people that if they had bad experiences, that they should not be mentioning the firm. Endlessly, we've had a discussion in Archilobby about putting out naughty and nice lists. And the thing that we've consistently run into is that you have to be willing to accept a lot of potential legal repercussions if you're putting out a naughty list. And so I think there is a tendency among organizations to default to, oh, well, look at these great practices, they're doing great things. Don't you want to be like the good practices? And yeah, I think there is some difficulty in that. I mean, I think for something like this, the model for what you do already exists in other industries, which is why I'm a member of my union, because the thing that happens in other industries when a workplace is treating its workers badly is industrial action. We've seen that throughout throughout this pandemic across the world, but even, you know, I'm in Melbourne. There's been a few strike actions in Coles warehouses here around safety conditions. And, you know, I'm not under any illusions that we're on the verge of a strike wave in architecture or anything like that. But I think we have to be aware that there is a model for this. The model is unionization. The model is collective organization of workers. And it's only when architecture workers are able to organize together and to collectively, you know, remove their labor, or at least very publicly be able to make a stand against practices who are behaving very badly, that you're going to be able to do that in safety. Because, you know, if I were to come out here and be like, so-and-so practice, they're treating their workers awfully, I would be putting myself in a pretty awful position. If you can get a good amount of the industry coming out and doing that, that completely changes it. And I think, like, the more architects start to see themselves as having strength in numbers and not just as their sort of own, like, individual ability to negotiate, the stronger we'll be as a profession, and the stronger we'll be as, like, architecture workers.
I have completely agree with that, and it's certainly something that we encounter at Parlour as well, as that, because we don't want to destroy our organisation, but we also want to find ways to call people to account. And so I wonder what the kind of representative role of the representative bodies are. I mean, John, I'm going to ask you a very sticky question. What do you do if you if you learn that one of your member practices is not behaving in a way that we would want? Or does the Institute have a role, or even, you know, registration boards? Can we look to these kind of major representative bodies to kind of take action?
I guess ACA has at this stage anyway been very much trying to educate. Rather, we don't have a disciplinary process in terms of our membership. What I'd say is I'd actually just try and dig a bit deeper into why this is happening, and a lot of the issues around this are related to the nature of what we do, but also the nature of the way we're taught to do it. And so is the reason that everyone's staying back till 3 a.m. in the morning because they have to get it out in a time because somebody hasn't actually stood up to the client and said, no, you can't get it by then? Or is it because we are very poor time managers and we aren't taught that at all during our sort of education, as to say, well, design is an iterative process, but it's got to stop at some point. And the other one that I wanted to bring up very early on is the nature of procurement, and the fact that a lot of the issues around this are related to poor procurement practices. Both in the way that we say yes to things that we shouldn't say yes to, nature of contracts and the nature of the industry to a certain extent. And so from the sort of point of view of where ACA wants to start is to actually get a lot of these things fixed up. So how do you actually manage your time well? How do you manage flexible work and all the other bits and pieces, and how do you stop these really crappy procurement methods which then impact on when you've got to do stuff, what you've got to produce, and for a fee that isn't adequate for the task. So it doesn't solve the thing of disciplinary procedures, and I'm not quite sure whether ACA has evolved to the point where we can do that yet, but certainly we can work on the positive side and to try and understand just what it is that has to change in the profession so that people can actually go home at a reasonable hour and have family life and all the other bits and pieces.
I wonder if I could throw to a quite specific and direct question from Dennis Kraja. Would you like to put your question, Dennis?
Yes, please. That would be great. Thanks.
Do you want to say it?
Okay, great. I'm just gonna open the camera as well. Sorry. Hi, everyone. So basically, my question is a little specific. In case you work for a building designer and not an architectural firm, are you covered by the award, although your title is a graduate of architecture and in the office are architects working as well?
John, do you have an answer for that?
My understanding is it's the definition of a graduate of architecture. I don't think it has to be within a registered architect's firm, but Ange, I don't know whether you can look that up in a bit more detail. We've got Angelina here as our CEO, hopefully doing some research in the background.
While Angelina's doing that, I think we have William Ward has an answer to that question.
Yeah.
Want to make any comment, William?
Well, I shouldn't pose this as, authority advice, but yeah, if your title is graduate of architecture, I think you should be covered by the award. But there is a separate award for drafts people and also interior designers covered by like the Clerks Award. So there are a few different awards you could be covered by.
Okay, thanks, William. And Ange?
Sorry, yeah, so there are awards, thank you very much. The Clark's Award, the Graphic Arts Award, the Drafting Awards, and also Interiors. I'm just going to pop that link in the chat section so you have a bit more information.
Thanks for that. Can I add a comment? Sorry.
Sure.
I'm sorry for the interruption. It's just that, Architects Award has some, I understand that there are different awards and other awards, but Architects Awards has some other privileges. Like, for example, if you're gonna go for the registration, you have 4 days of leave, paid leave, just for the registration, right? Which you don't have on the other awards. So basically what happens is that, of course, this leaves a little bit of interpretation. There's space for interpretation. So, but Architects Awards, you are more protected and you have some benefits which you don't have on the other ones. And specifically, like in my case, for example, I've started the process of registration and I should have some benefits if I'm covered by the Architects Award, but if I'm covered by miscellaneous or the others, I don't have those benefits. So these include as well, for example, forced annual, when the office is closed during the Christmas time and stuff like that. So in the Architects Awards, you cannot force an employee to get annual leave if you don't agree, right? And in the others, you can with the notice of 4 weeks. So all these things are a little bit, like you have some advantages if you're covered by the award. You don't have these advantages and this leaves space for abuse sometimes, unfortunately.
Yeah, can we take that on notice?
Thanks.
Sorry, and we'll get back to you.
Sorry. Of course, thank you.
The award system is not like a flawless system, and there's always going to be edge cases. But I think that if you have architect or architecture in the title, you should be like pretty safe in assuming that that's the relevant award. And just because the practice that you work in is not an architecture practice, like, in the practice I work in, there are people who would be on the Clerks Award. Like, you don't need to be in an office that is made up solely of people who are in that award. So I think, yeah, you should be able to claim that you're on the Architects Award on that basis.
Great, thank you.
But let's find out some more information about that. But it certainly sounds like it's about your role and your education. It's certainly in the Architecture Award, it's also about education, I believe.
Justine, I don't know whether it's just me, but we seem to be getting a bit of sound interference. Is there something happening near your microphone? Piece of cloth or something?
Oh, I put my notes over the top of it. Sorry. Anyway, okay. So I believe, firstly, the union might be able to help with that question further, and also I think the ACA is going to have a look into that a little bit more, and we can get back to you, Dennis. But thank you for that.
Thank you. Thanks.
Now, where are we? There's quite a lot of discussion here about internships, and I guess I would just like to say that there's some quite good and clear guidelines around internships and what's allowed and what's not allowed in Australia, which is not the case, as John mentioned, in the UK and the US. The ACA has published quite a bit of stuff around that, but for internships run within a university have to meet certain requirements and they have to be part of an educational program. So it's not just a way of getting unpaid labour. So again, that's probably, and I know the ACA pretty much checks out any university internship program it comes across to make sure it does comply. Do you want to say anything? Anyone want to say anything about internship programs with John or Lewis?
I mean, you shouldn't work if you're not getting paid. And I think if that's a situation you find yourself in, you should be talking to your colleagues about whether this is a normal practice. You should be reaching out to Archilobby, you should be reaching out to the union. Obviously, people find themselves in situations where they feel like compelled to take work that's either unpaid or underpaid, pretty obvious reasons, especially in, pretty fucked economic times like we're in at the moment. And I don't think you should necessarily, view it as like a moral failing on your behalf, because people are forced to take positions in these circumstances. But like, reach out to other people, determine whether this is normal, determine like, what this practice tends to behave like, and yeah, I'd move forward on that basis.
And again, with the university ones, they have to be part of a course of study that's actually, John, you were talking before about how there's programs in South Australia you found very useful as an employer for finding great people.
Yes, it has been, and I think it's one of those things which, when I studied, which is an extremely long time ago, you had to do 6 months in an office to actually qualify for your degree, and I think that sort of fell apart in bad economic times, a bit like this. But that connection between student and office is a really critical one. I think it's important both for the practices to have that connection with the universities and the students to have the connection with practices. And anything that can make that work better, I think, is really worth thinking about. I know many practices who have a policy of always having at least one or more students sort of employed there, and it really works well.
Okay, I wonder if we can shift the conversation a little bit to some of the good
without shuffling your papers.
Oh,
so no.
God. We've got so many questions. Okay, I was thinking we might throw to Elizabeth Carpenter. Elizabeth, do you want to talk a little bit about the new prize in New South Wales, which is in the kind of model of showing best practice?
Yeah, sure. That'd be great. Thanks for that. I was sort of busily typing away there. So look, this is an initiative of the New South Wales chapter, and look, it just started last year, and the reason why we felt it was really important to create it was to actually just start to get people to talk about these issues. And last year, I think we had, how many entries was it? I can't remember now. I think it was about
lots.
15. Yeah. And it was really, really interesting. And I think the feedback we got from everyone was that it did actually make the practices really examine what they were doing. And so the idea is that it's used as obviously someone will win it, but also it does mean that we can really start to share our experiences and learn from each other as well. So you find that different practices had different initiatives that they had in place. So the idea was to actually share that information, and by having this sort of critical mass of movement, that we just overall kind of improve how we all work. So this one for this year is about to be released. It'll be in about a week, I think. And what we've done this time is actually split it into 2 categories. So there's sort of a small practice option, or small to medium, and then medium to large. So it does mean that it will, because I think both sizes of practice have slightly different conditions sometimes. So the idea was to sort of pick up, and also we are using, I guess, the lens of COVID as well to just sort of try and understand how everyone was responding. So anyway, I'd really encourage all of your practices that you work in to enter. I think it's a really good way of getting people to actually talk and focus about all these issues. And there's some quite sort of pertinent questions in the questionnaire as well that people will suddenly go, oh, I don't have that, I better organise it and do it. So, yeah.
So I was on the jury of that award last year, and I have to say, there was some very, very impressive entries. It was really, again, heartening, given all the horror stories that I hear, very heartening to see such a great deal of effort going into practices in terms of, building a kind of culture which, is best practice as the thing says. Because I think this is the point, that poor employment practices hurt everybody. They hurt all the practices that are doing the right thing as well, because, as John said, we go back to procurement and fee bids and things like that. You can't put in terribly low, you can't fee cut extremely if you're paying your staff properly to do the work. And so the playing field is incredibly uneven for everybody when you've got the sort of poor behaviour at the lower end of the profession. So I think, again, this is a thing for us all. This is a thing for practice to take very seriously as well. And
so much of it is about education, really, isn't it? And and a lot of things people just don't know the information.
Well, I think that's, certainly that's the good side of it. People don't know, so we're here to educate. And then I think there's people do know and they behave badly, and that's where we need that kind of collective action that Lewis is talking about.
Yeah, could I just, because I think this is a really, really key case, I think, of like why it is that bad practices exist. Like, I appreciate the idea that like it's not in anyone's interest to, treat their workers badly or anything like that. Like, there is a certain logic to that, but also when we're talking about fee bids, the fact that if you pay your workers less, you can put in a lower bid and you can get more work is like exactly why these bad practices exist. They exist because they're like advantageous to practices that treat their workers that way. And so I think without like being open, like clear-minded about like why it is that these exist, it's going to continue to exist. Like, these practices are advantageous in that they allow these businesses to get more work, make more profit. And so, yeah, I don't think education is going to be sufficient on this front because of that. Like, they're not doing it accidentally. They're not doing it because they don't know that you could pay your workers for the time they work. They're doing it because it makes them more money.
Though there's certainly an argument that engaged, happy, well-rested, productive employees produce a hell of a lot better work. So
well, I would like to think that that's when everyone's producing their best work, but
certainly
I guess it depends on the standard of work you're wanting to produce.
That's right. Yes, indeed. Yes. Okay. So, gosh, this is Naomi. Have you got questions from the chat that you want to pose?
Well, Sharon Bowman has an observation, which is alarming, although not surprising. Sharon, do you want to put your observation to the group? Or I can do it.
Oh, hi, Naomi and everybody. Thank you. Yes, just listening to the conversation, it was an observation that I had observed and actually had the experience, but I saw that being older and more experienced, I was able to navigate out of the situation, but I saw students in the same situation around me and then heard anecdotal evidence after the fact. So, William has observed that as well, I noticed.
So can you make your observation for those who aren't reading the chat?
Oh, yes, sorry. I shall just read it out. That a strategy that I've witnessed is studio tutors recruiting current students or former students and either not paying, underpaying or delayed paying under the guise that the small firm was offering grad experience to grads that the grads could then trade on. So it was positioned as not even a win-win, but it was positioned as a win for the grad or the student, not only in their work life, but in their studio work. You work for us, you will automatically be getting a high D or a high distinction in the high distinction range, or in fact, a high distinction. So it was sold, the idea was sold.
Mm. Sharon, it's kind of, as I say, horrifying to hear that, especially given that universities are professionalizing more and more by the second, and academic work is also professionalizing, even for sessional staff who are architecture practitioners. And these things are these days governed by very extensive policies, and we would call that a straight up abuse of power / conflict of interest / corruption. So, right. I mean, certainly the universities would never allow that if they had wind of it. But the thing is, they may not know about it.
No, it's discussed. But people stay silent because people are desperate, students are desperate for the opportunity. The industry there's an oversupply of graduates. So that's really the baseline reason. In any industry where there's an oversupply, then you have to compromise when you want experience, when you want to get your 3 years experience.
Well, but do you have to compromise? I suppose that's the question. Maybe we can put that to John and Lewis. Like, if you're in a vulnerable position, or let's say part of a disempowered population, which we might say students and recent graduates are, especially in the present environment, how much should they compromise, or should they compromise at all? And what happens if they don't?
Well, I would say they shouldn't, particularly this issue of tutors. I think somehow the university must find out about it. I've certainly heard those stories in the past, and I feel that they're particularly shocking because, as Naomi said, it's not just free labour, it's abuse of power. So that's the first thing. Should they compromise? No, they shouldn't actually. But it's easy to say if you're not trying to find a job, and the job market is as it is at the moment. Lewis?
Yeah. I mean, like, obviously it's a pretty awful position to be put in, and if you feel like you're not going to be able to get work, well, if you don't have experience and you don't think you can be able to get work without that experience, like, you can see exactly why students would go along with it. I think, it's definitely necessary in those positions, even if, someone on this call finds himself in that position and is like, fuck, I just need to take it. You should still be talking to people about it. Like, I think the thing that makes this most, like, completely pernicious is the fact that everyone stays silent about it. There's like a huge tendency, I think, throughout the industry to, you don't want to talk about how much you make. You don't want to talk about the conditions that you work under. If you get like laid off, you don't want to talk about it. Like, it's a tiny community. You don't want to like rock the boat. Like, rocking the boat is the way that this stuff gets fixed. So if you are in that position and you feel like you just need to stick it out, at least make sure people are aware of what's going on. Because otherwise it's going to keep happening, and you should be doing that with an eye to like how you make sure that the people who follow on from you are in a better position than you are. Because yeah, like we need to stop that from being a thing that's able to happen, and kind of normalize it within universities, that like it's spread around when that happens. The university finds out.
Exactly. That's what I would say. You know, speaking as someone in a leadership position in a university, I would want the student to come directly to me, and we would sort that out, I can tell you. Thank you very much for your comment, Sharon. I wonder if we might throw to Kim Baisley, our friend Kim Baisley, who always has excellent observations and has one about time management in practice as a source of insufficient poor practice.
It was a bit of an aside because it's not really on topic, but I guess I think there is a culture of working massive overtime in architecture, and I think a lot of the time it's because of the nature of what we do, and that as somebody said, the iterative process can end up leading to massive rework. And you know, I think it's probably because as a profession we don't tend to necessarily employ people who are really good project managers. So, you know, we're very creative by nature, but there's some people who are really good at managing process. And if teams had more of those kind of people around to kind of help them actually manage the process, there wouldn't be so much rework. You know, they could make sure that they got the inputs that they needed at the right time. I mean, I've sat around at 10 o'clock at night waiting for the director, you know, to give me sort of direction on whether something's going to be, I mean, not recently, but, you know, when I was younger, on whether we were going to go in a certain direction or not. And, you know, the whole team sitting there waiting for that kind of input. So that there's a lot of wasted time, especially with junior staff who are seen as expendable. Yeah.
John, I wonder if we could link that to your interest in time management that you mentioned earlier.
Well, I think that's true. And I think one thing that a culture that starts at university in terms of, you know, pulling all-nighters and the idea that if you just stick at it for another hour, you'll actually get the right solution, whatever that right solution is very difficult to break once you get out into practice. I think there's a lot of problems with many practices in terms of, particularly small practices, in terms of trying to take on too much for one person. So the project management side of it, but you know, how do you teach people to make decisions quickly and to prioritise what those decisions are? We had a session on Monday where I said, you know, you're going to make 1 million decisions sort of as you go through this project, and only about 4 or 5 of them are going to be that important that you need to pick them and fight your battles on. That sort of training doesn't come naturally to architects. And I'm not sure how to get over that. But I think, you know, as people who run practices, we've got to be better with our own time too. So it's not just time management of employees, but it's our own time management, because if you haven't got time to sit down with this, with your staff and listen to them and go through things with them, the whole process breaks down and everyone just wastes time.
I mean, could I weigh in? I think that there is obviously like a cultural or like an education element around time management, I suppose. But I think that identifying that as like the source of the problem is kind of putting the cart before the horse. Like, I think certainly, I mean, my experience of like architecture education, I think I've mentioned this to some archaeology people on the call before, but my first week at Monash, I was told, if you're not pulling all-nighters in this course, you're not working hard enough. Now, I'm given to understand that that's changed. That's not a thing that is pushed quite as hard from the front anymore. But you know, there's obviously like a bit of culture that has been built around it. But I would tend to think that that's not a thing that exists autonomously from practice, and that that's actually a thing that's been sort of built backwards from practice. Because when you're not needing to pay people for overtime, there is no disincentive for making people work overtime. And I think this is like a really key problem in architecture, because like, as Kim was saying, it's awful when you like get the material you need at, you know, 5, and then you're expected to work on it for another 5 or 6 hours before it goes out, and you're just having to stay up all night doing it. That sucks for you, the worker. But in terms of the effect that that has on your boss, it has no effect at all. The work gets done. They didn't need to pay you more. There's no disincentive for the practice to continue working in that way. And I think while that disincentive continues to be completely absent, there's no learning that's going to happen, because there's no need for it to change. It works very well for the practice. I think if you were able to actually enforce payment for overtime, it would act as a strong disincentive to make people work overtime, because you have to pay at an increased rate. And it would act as a really strong incentive to appropriately resource teams. Like, if you have more people on the team, more people with the right skills, more people who are good at time management, resource to that team, then you don't need to work long nights. But when that just acts as like an extra cost on the project, it's going to keep happening. Like, the only way that that problem is solved is by like workers being able to collectively assert their right to be paid for the time that they work. And yeah, I mean, as William said in the chat, like, part of that is being able to collectively assert that you will not work it if it's not paid.
I wonder if we could, I mean, a lot of what we're discussing here are ongoing issues, which have been the case for many years in architecture, although of course we find ourselves now in a new and somewhat unique position because of the pandemic. So, and that's what Emma's question is taking us back to. I know, Emma, you're on a phone. Do you want to say your question, or do you want me to say it for you?
You can say it.
Okay.
Thanks.
It's a good question, Emma, which is, rights during a pandemic or during other types of emergency. It seems all usual protections are overridden and we are at the employer's mercy. For example, stand down provisions. Are there any protections under the Architects Award in emergency or pandemic situations?
Who wants to go first?
I won't say I know all the detail of it. Most of the award changes related to COVID-19 are basically across the board. So I don't think there's been anything in particular. There's been a few bits, Justine, on the Clark's Award, but nothing specifically on the Architects Award that would be different to any other award. Lewis, am I right on that, I think?
Yeah, I think the stand down stuff seems, as far as I can tell, to be entirely legal. So I don't think legal recourse is going to exist there. I mean, not to keep banging this drum, but like, there's a reason I'm banging it. Like, the way that you can prevent, like, I got a lot of horror stories at the very start when we were locking down, and I basically spent a week just getting texts and emails from people saying X number of people have been stood down here, wages have been cut by 20% in this firm, wages have been cut by 10% in this firm, whatever. Like, the only way that you can stop that in this kind of situation is for all of the workers in that practice to talk to each other, to collectively decide that like they're not okay with it and to refuse to work for those wages. Like, if you are on your own in a large practice and you are the only one standing up against it, like, of course your employer is able to put the boot in. But like, this is why it's so important that you, like, especially during this like pretty weird time. I'm in Melbourne, we're going to be working from our homes in like this weird atomized situation for ages. Like, you have to stay in contact with your colleagues. You have to be talking about changes that are being forced to your conditions, because like the strength that you have is all of you together. And if you're able to like go to your boss after they've proposed like, you know, a 20% cut to your pay or similar, and say, we have all talked about this, we do not agree to do this, then you actually have some power. But without that, like, especially at the moment, I think there's going to be a lot of bosses riding roughshod over people.
I mean, I think there's a number of issues on this. So you can't, if people are being asked to take pay cuts, they still can't go below the award. So the award pay rates have not changed. They're still an absolute minimum. What has changed, I think, is the capacity, unpaid pandemic leave, and the capacity. There are kind of leave provision things that have changed. But you can't, and so often yes, a lot of practices have had pay cuts, and a lot of those pay cuts are happening at the top. So, you know, quite a few practices I'm aware of have taken, you know, the principals have taken massive pay cuts, and then it's graded down to those at the, you know, the juniors who have much lesser pay cuts. Now, for me, that is a much more reasonable approach than the stories that Lewis is telling, which I absolutely am not saying don't exist. I certainly am aware of one practice which had proposed quite substantial pay cuts with absolutely no reduction in work. And in that case, the employees did get together. They did go and say this is unreasonable, and all of that, and those that situation was withdrawn. That was not, the practice found another way forward. I mean, I think as Kim basically points out here that, you know, there are many firms that are really struggling. And so I think this is a point where I wonder if we might talk about how, you know, going back to this idea of care, how we might work together to actually, because there'll be no jobs if there are no practices, which is not an excuse to say people should be exploited, but how do practices and employees work together to kind of navigate this situation? And I think look, there are some shocking practices who will always behave badly, and we need to deal with that. There are many practices who I think who are trying to work a way through this. And if, you know, the leadership session we ran quite a few weeks ago now, but we talked quite a lot about those kinds of stresses. So looking to those practices that might be more reasonable, how might we work together, I think would be I mean, am I being too Pollyanna to?
It would be nice. We need more Pollyannas around, I think. I would say too, from the emails and from our pulse check surveys, there are a lot of practice owners and, you know, principals and so on who are under an incredible stress at the moment. People have lost 100% of their work. Now, how that pans out in terms of things like the way JobKeeper tapers off or whatever, we don't really know at the moment. And I guess we want to go back to do some more surveying, sort of probably towards the end of September to actually find out. And we've probably got a very different situation now in Victoria than we had a few weeks ago too. And I think it's the understanding that the people running the practice are human too. And, you know, even just the stress of actually trying to set up, you know, working from home and stuff at the beginning was really, you know, providing difficulties for both the staff and the people running the practice. So it does have to be open communication, looking after each other as much as anything. I mean, most practices are so small, it's not the traditional large, the boss sort of sitting up in a glass cage somewhere and thousands of people sort of answering to that. That's sort of not what the profession is like. There are big practices, obviously, but it is important to understand that everyone's under pressure and to make allowances for that.
There's a very nice conversation at the moment going on between Kim and William in the chat around the communication and trust. And I think that's, one of the questions we asked in the Parlour survey was around the cultures of trust, which is absolutely fundamental if any of this is to move forward. And obviously we know that that's everywhere. I know we're really running out of time, but I just wanted to ask, and I absolutely agree about...
I've seen the papers.
Oh, sorry. It's all a bit much this week. Collective action, absolutely. But can we offer some advice to those people who might be right now in a situation where they've been renegotiating or they're being asked to renegotiate their employment conditions and they're not that comfortable with what's on offer? Can you offer some advice on top of talking to people in collective action about how to proceed in the kind of immediate context that some people are finding themselves in?
I mean, look, I'm not going to profess to be a master negotiator. I think my pay packet would probably support that. But I think that once again, you need to know what it is that other people are being paid. You need to be talking to your colleagues and know what is the standard. Secrecy around pay packets is what produces a lot of imbalances between pay packets. So I think the most important thing is to know what your colleagues who are at a similar level to you are being paid, and to go in armed with that knowledge. And, obviously, make sure that you're being paid at or above the minimum wage. So I think that's going to be the strongest position. That's going to put you in the strongest position, because I think there's a tendency to, if you go in completely blind, you're like, I would really like to be paid more. Please, may I have more? That puts you in a pretty awful position. You have no ability to negotiate. You have no basis for understanding how pay is being distributed. So yeah, I think the main thing that you need to know is what everyone else is being paid. And there's a pretty easy way to find that out.
I would add to that about the different kinds of conditions and different ways that practices are navigating this. And you can find out about what other practices are doing, and you can do that. The Parlour survey stuff is still coming out, but we put a lot of that on Instagram a couple of weeks ago and had people come back and say, oh, I'm realizing my practice is not the norm and that I can expect more, and that this data is gives me some power to go in there and say, well, look, this is what's happening more broadly across the profession. So I think that's really important. The ACA has been publishing profiles on what practices are doing to try and manage things. Again, this is showing the good, the good rather than the ugly, but sometimes arming yourself with knowledge of the good and what's the norm across the industry can also be really helpful. John, we're really running out of time, but what would you say to someone who's trying to work their way through this right now?
I don't think I've got much more to add to Lewis. I think they need to understand the situation that the practice is in too. If the practice is making a huge profit at the expense of their workers, that is problematic for me too. It's got to be and I think one of the things to come out of the whole COVID thing will be changes to working arrangements and maybe changes to the way that there is an openness around work practices and even the sort of financial stuff around how practices work. The nice thing would be if practice employees rose up and said, no, you're not going to put in a fee that low because that's going to affect me. You know, it's been a problem all along, and that we undervalue what we do, and the long-term sort of benefits of good practice and good architecture is something that other professions don't seem to have as much of a problem with. Yeah. So we've just got to believe in ourselves a bit more and the value of what we do.
Value our work, the work of our colleagues, and the work of our profession.
I think we should wrap it up there, Justine. I think that's an excellent note upon which to finish. So do you want to say the last words? Absolutely, that's my last word. We need to value in financially, but more than that, what we do and what our colleagues do. And, you know, honestly, I think I've been saying this as long as I've been involved in, you know, for the last 15 years ranting on about this. I also, yeah, I don't know, like, let's just value what we do. Let's not, anyway, I'm going to start ranting about fee cutting. I won't do that, but I do think, actually, that's the one thing I would say, is we need to stand up and say no more often. So employees might need to say no to their employer. Sometimes, as John was just suggesting them, but I think practices need to say no to unreasonable procurement situations and unreasonable demands. And, you know, I think William Ward said something really useful in the chat earlier about how, you know, it needs to be unprofitable for practices to have these exploitative relationships. And I think it's time for people, you know, government organisations to set up and be model clients, not the world's worst clients. And so I think, you know, we always say this, don't we, Paolo? You need to say yes more often. You need to say no more often. You need to say no when it's, and so practices, you know, need to stand up for their value of their work and the work of their employees. So let's have a virtual round of applause and thank our guests, John Held and Lewis Moore.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming. I know it's tricky, this one.
It is tricky. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, lines persons. Thank you, ball persons.
Next week, sorry. Next week we have the second part of our session on cultural diversity. We have Sarah Buckeridge from Hayball and Tiwa Gill from Grimshaw, both talking about the effective management of practices to support inclusion and cultural diversity. So that will be great. So we hope to see you all for the next one. Have a lovely weekend.